and the amended version of the Section 32. That these are amended versions of that are online at present. Now, to start with the presentation, we'll just run over. You haven't had a presentation on this second part of the chapter since January, so we've made quite a bit of progress since then. What does this part cover? Excuse me. We've got floor level and fill management areas, repair of land. These areas were covered. These topics were covered over in the first part of the chapter. We've extended them further, as you'll see in subsequent slides. Repair of ponding areas, which we had policies on in the first part of the chapter. High flood hazard management areas. We had those areas identified within the Waimakariri floodplain in the first part of the chapter. We're extending it as commensurate with studies we've done for the second part. Tidying up a little bit of unfinished business in the slope stability areas and, of course, new coastal hazard management areas. So for the floor level and fill management areas, new information has enabled us to extend the mapping of those areas over more of the notified zones, primarily the residential zones. We've identified those areas. This is a major flood event, or the 1 in 200 year scale event for rural specific purpose and open space zones. And we've carried over similar provisions that exist for both the Waimakariri floodplain and the areas around Te Waihora, Lake Ellesmere, and Te Waiviua, Lake Forsyth. And this is a map which is a little bit hard for you to see, but if you focus in on the dark blue areas, if I hold this pointer steady, around here west of the railway line, a little tiny bit sort of east, but primarily west of the railway line, which we'd identified in preparing the first part of the chapter, that later data would help to identify that. Some of the new Woolston data has picked up both Woolston and a large part of the central city. There's part of Hallsville identified, following on down towards Lake Ellesmere, Te Waihora as well. And with new information gathered in the major flood events in the Lake Forsyth, Little River settlement area, we've managed to improve on the data we have there. Repair of land, this is information that's all direction under the SERA Act. We've carried those provisions over, and we've tried to streamline this part of the chapter, as you'll see, by cross-referencing to those provisions in the first part of the chapter. Ponding areas, these are naturally occurring ones. You'll be familiar with a number of them around the city, including Hendersons Basin, the Hoonhay Valley, and Cranford Basin. These areas have been recognised in the operative plan since 1995. We've tightened up provisions a little bit to reflect how important it is to maintain the storage capacity of these areas. And this is a shot of Hendersons Basin. I'd say it's pretty much in a full flood capacity area, looking towards the hills there. So you can see how important it is to have these areas to store the water in before they trickle down through the rest of the urban areas. Well, I think primarily this is all rural, still rural land. The bit that you might be interested in is probably off the photo here with the residential new neighbourhood area, sort of north of Sparks Road.
Yeah. Would that be underwater as well?
I couldn't answer that. Graham Harrington,
There's a small amount ponded behind Sparks Road.
But again, as part of that residential new neighbourhood, the outline development plan identifies areas for stormwater storage and mitigation over to actually hold the water in times like this and to let it trickle away and avoid inundating residential areas.
Yeah, no, it's just really interesting to to look at the context of all the new subdivisions, and still it's quite good reassured to know that we do have area for the flooding to still go.
Yep.
This will never change. We'll keep this, won't we, as the
Yes,
basin?
and the council owns large areas of land there, and
Yeah.
some of the filling provisions that we've got are to stop filling of these areas, particularly because they're so important to
Yeah.
maintain that strategic natural storage capacity.
Excellent.
High flood hazard areas, we've had research undertaken that's identified these areas that are primarily, if they're in the Waimakariri floodplain, the main issue there is the speed of water, that it can create a life safety risk to people and damage property. For the urban areas, it's primarily about the depth of water being deeper than a metre. A lot of these areas coincide with areas that have identified both for as red zoned areas and also under the coastal hazard provisions. In Table 5, if you look at the copy that I've circulated, you'll see there's one column that wasn't completed as part of the Stage 1 chapter, and we've largely just tried to keep a consistent approach. And that column represents land beyond all those mapped areas that are mapped as either cliff collapse, rock fall or mass movement. So that's all the Port Hills and the wider Becks Peninsula area. Coastal hazards, you've received your copy. That's still confidential. The Coastal Hazards Assessment should have received that last weekend. That's being peer reviewed, and we'll come back to you with that review probably in another month or so. But that report has identified coastal erosion and seawater inundation during storm events. Didn't deal with tsunami, as I mentioned earlier today. We're using a NIWA report to map tsunami for information only. We expect that the tsunami areas will largely coincide with the coastal erosion areas. So we've got some restriction there in terms of intensification of development that's proposed. Pardon me?
Coastal erosion or coastal inundation?
Well, I haven't seen the maps overlaid. We're still getting that information brought on board, but I suspect it will probably be both. It will probably coincide with both those areas, as do the coastal erosion and inundation areas. We've mapped them both for the 50-year period and also for the 50 to 100-year period, as is on the slide there.
Phil had a question.
I think, it's really just in terms of too, I understand it doesn't really cover, the report doesn't really cover future or likely tectonic change or uplift or down or sinking.
Yeah.
No, I don't think it does, no, because that's too uncertain really, but it effectively assesses the impact of accelerated sea level rise associated with climate change, and also with the acceleration in storm events or exacerbation in storm events over that time as well, and that's what's factored into the inundation studies.
Has there been any consideration of land uplift over a period? We're on I forget which plate we're on. One goes under the other.
Yes, yeah.
So is there any correlation between natural uplift of land and sea level rise?
I'm not sure about that detail. They certainly use the current LiDAR information, which is the mapping of the land surface at the moment.
We're using the LiDAR information, and we've had no correlation with natural uplift of land.
But there has been natural uplift as a result of the
earthquake.
earthquake.
Yes, but I'm talking about natural uplift of land through tectonic plate movement.
Sorry,
Yeah,
I
we've
thought
got
that
you
was
right
called
here.
an
Thank you.
earthquake.
Ian can
Just on that point,
Yeah.
when I was reviewing the coastal hazard report, the one thing that geologist stuck in my mind is sea level is one thing, a constant, but it's all relative to land.
Yeah.
So although the report doesn't specifically address the tectonics, so that's the long-term stability of our landmass, New Zealand, I have started making some inquiries with that, and I've been talking to Mark Yetten, who's a structural geologist, very good repute. So the good news for North Canterbury is that the land seems to be slowly uplifting. However, for us, essentially because we're in the basin of the Pegasus Basin, it's slowly subsiding. Now, I haven't got the exact rates, and I don't think it's going to make a huge impact on the relative sea level rise, but there is a sort of local differences that
Right.
we could drill down a bit deeper on. North Canterbury is basically going up. That's a structural sort of component with the faults there, and then the basin sort of the size dropping. But again, I'll just that's over geological periods, so the rates would be very, very slow.
It'd be millimetres over centuries, would it?
Pretty much, yeah.
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 Phil?
Look, I've been interested in the science too, and have had some helpful discussions with Helen on this, and I just think this is where, as councillors too, and it's coming, like Christmas in a sense, but the representation by Deirdre Hart and the other people who made that from the NERP presentations, and since then she's put out their paper too, and it's called Summed Up a Sinking City. So I think that's other sort of information which we as councillors clearly will take into account around these issues. I don't know if staff want to comment on that sort of part of the science.
Yeah, there was an article in the press about this a number of, or a few months ago now, because it wasn't just Deirdre Hart, it was co-authored by, was it?
Matthew Huey.
Mark Quigley, yeah. Mark Quigley was the name I was looking for. So, yeah, and it was a very good piece of work, and it was good that it was in the public arena. But I don't know that enough people have really seen it, so I think that we might, in the period that we've got between now and when this comes back from the ministers, actually advertise the link to the ECAM website that's got that presentation on it. Because I noticed in the NERP report yesterday that there were over 250 people had already gone to that website to have a look. It's the most popular link point for any of the NERP presentations, and which means that there's a lot of public interest in this. And I think that we should encourage that public interest. We're going to have serious debates around these issues, and people need to understand the science, and we need to make the science very plain and simple for people to see for themselves, because a lot of the decisions, none of the decisions we're making in this area are political decisions. They're actually decisions that have got to be based on evidence and science. Anyway,
Okay.
happy days.
Thank you. I'm just moving along now to the next part. Here we've got a snapshot from one of the planning maps that shows the lower part of the Brighton spit, and what I'm just going to talk you through now, and if you've got a copy of the Natural Hazard Planning Map Stage 3, you can have a look at it in more detail. But effectively, this dark green band here represents that area subject to coastal erosion within the next 50 years, so that's on the open coast. Different processes happen within the estuary side of the spit, and you can see the dark green band here is quite a lot wider. It's a little bit hard to pick up, but you can see it's quite a lot wider here. The light green black band is that area subject to coastal erosion in the 50 to 100 year period. Sometimes there isn't a great deal of difference, as you can see along here in the inner part of the spit. Now, overlaid on top of that, which is a little bit hard to make out, is the diagonal lines that represent, firstly, there's blue diagonal lines representing coastal inundation during a storm event in the next 50-year period. So that's when water will go in and be there for a period and come back out again. And then there's also lavender coloured lines that are very hard to see here. There's some up here which will as coastal inundation in that 50 to 100 year period. So if you look at your legend, look at the map, you'll be able to work that out. Now what's also overlaid there, which is probably one of the most prominent things to see, is the polka dots. And if you'll remember back to the stage 1 chapter, that's those areas that are subject to flooding in a major flood event. So that's the floor level and fill management areas.
And the one thing that's missing from that map is the residential red zone.
Yes.
That would be useful to see where that overlays, because
Right.
it's quite a considerable amount of the left-hand side of that picture.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Yes, we do. We do have some maps put together that show the residential red zone underneath. They're not in the district planning maps though, because they're not a district plan zone.
But I can bring those in. for
Yanni's
councillors
asked
to
the
look at as
question
well.
where the motor camp is, and I think it's one. Is it off the map? Oh yeah, it's off. It's not off Rocking Horse Road. This is Rocking Horse Road, Yanni. It's not Bridge Street.
So it's further up.
Yeah, but it still will be covered by all of those dots and crossed lines, purple and blue.
Okay, so if we just move along to another example from the Becks Peninsula area, this is a snapshot from map 77 showing the Akaroa settlement. So a similar situation here. If you look at your map, you can see that there's a lot of the dark green colour area is subject to erosion, coastal erosion, or potential shoreline retreat over the next 50 years. Now, an interesting information that from our technical people, they've indicated that those areas also are largely kind of like also, or very similar to the floor level and fill management areas. So effectively, because of the criteria or technical attributes of the analysis, effectively we're identifying similar areas.
Mm.
But they didn't apply over there before.
We
is that
haven't done
right?
the work in that area, but largely because of, as I said, the attributes that are used. That's
I think that's a fine.
that's very useful to have that there. Something that's quite considerable here. You can sort of see the dark lines there, and I can't quite make them out. The diagonal lines showing the inundation as well, and not a great deal of light green beyond the dark green. That's the light green is the area subject to erosion in the 50 to 100 year period. Not surprising given the topography around the settlement.
But this is this won't be a kind of shock to people in the area, because this is very similar to the mapping that was produced in the Stage 1 Tonkin and Taylor report.
That's
that had a
quite
lot of
correct, Your
publicity
Worship.
at Christmas
Yes.
2013.
That's
Yeah.
right. So that's the that
Upset
report.
my
And
holiday.
effectively, what this latest report that's being peer reviewed is showing us is a lot more detail. It's also drilling down to that 50-year time frame.
Yeah.
The 2013 report only gave us looked out to 100 years, and,
Yeah.
and as we've described before, we think it's really important to both sort of coincide with other legislation like the Building Act that provides for the life of a building for 50 years, and it's also a lot more tangible for us to plan in terms of our strategic planning and planning for people's sort of comprehension and be able to understand what a 50-year time frame would look like.
Is there any time that we're going to actually regard a 50-year horizon for a building as not sustainable? You know, I mean, it seems to me that if we're really if the Building Act says that we expect a building to last for 50 years, I reckon that was done at a time before we had building materials that are available today. I'm just saying, you know,
Yep.
really, it just seems to me that that's not a sustainable outlook and a planning framework. Anyway.
She does raise that question though, if we are planning for this, for the 50-year timeline, do we allow new buildings to go there?
Eh?
Do we allow new buildings to be built in these areas?
Well, yeah, that is part of the question, but that's a bigger issue. Yeah.
That is partly what we are addressing in our rules, of course.
Yeah,
and
but and what is built back? So we're also not so these are not areas that you would want to have a lot of intensification happening. And if you are building in these areas, you want to be looking at your floor levels, and your setbacks. You know, so those are the things that we would be looking at. But fortunately, the mapping for the coastal erosion the mapping for the coastal inundation is almost identical to the mapping for the new
flood levels.
Yeah,
floor levels, fill management areas. I'm going to remember it. And so our FMAs, So I just need to add FL to the old FMAs. So FL FMAs are pretty much aligned. So that means that people who are in the areas that are identified in what we're working on here will not be in any different position than they were in when we looked at stage 1. So that they don't need to worry that they've got any more exposure than they had before. Might be additional in terms of coastal, but it's still the same as far as what you do to resolve against it, which is to make sure that your fill and floor levels are appropriate.
So that's correct. Just reinforce that effectively those rules still apply, so that adaptive measure of being able to raise your floor levels, that's still there. But what we're saying, if there's subdivision proposed to create new vacant lots or new buildings beyond the footprint of existing ones, then we're proposing to take a much more restrictive approach. And that's for those areas that are subject to both inundation and storm events and erosion in the 50-year time frame. For the 50 to 100-year time frame, there's a lot less certainty. While the high-level documents tell us to plan for 100 years, we all know that an awful lot can happen in that time frame. We've also got the natural hazards strategy being prepared by the council that's looking ahead to the future and taking an overarching viewpoint. In an ideal world, we'd have that there to provide us with guidance, but we're taking a bit of a lead here, and we're probably sticking our necks out a little bit and saying we'll still provide for some restriction on development in these areas, but much less so until we really know what's happening, and it gives us that breathing space.
Could I ask a question about with in a couple of cases with the South New Brighton area, in conversation with them, I've indicated, look, you really do need to take this on board in submitting to council, and they have heard that, which is good. But there is some kind of ambiguity when they look around them and see in terms of assets. The ministry has now said, well, the South New Brighton School will be the main place where you go. And we're putting in a new playground down there. Well, that's kind of minor level asset. And now we've got the conversation over the motor camp. So there is confusion for them, and I guess what they want is certainty. But they are certainly taking this on board.
Yes. Yeah. And those, the various ministries are sitting around the table with us. I'm not sure about Ministry for the Education as such, but certainly a number of the ministries are, and that information will be feeding back to them.
Well, I think the Ministry of Education should be sitting around the table because, and I think Glenn raises a very good point, because it's interesting. Is it this? It's not satellite telephones. What are the radio telephone network that's made available for schools is made available in secondary schools, and all of the schools that are along the coastline are primary schools. So there doesn't seem to be I think there really does need to be some strategic thinking around around schools. And I think that, South New Brighton's a classic case because, I just know exactly what happened there after the last earthquake. And, so I just, and you do worry about decisions that are made. If the motor camp gets rebuilt, it has to be rebuilt to these new levels. So it's not... people just think that it's just a question of putting back what was there. It isn't. So there's a lot of work to be done on these issues, and we need to let the community know what they're all about.
And that's it. They just want some certainty because they're getting mixed messages over public investment from the ministry with the school council saying this, and they're thinking what's going on. So, yeah.
Well, this rule table, which is on Rule 511, page starts on page 19 of the amended version that I've given you, but the unamended version, which is still pretty much the same for it is the same for the coastal hazard management areas. That's online. People can see that. They can see the mapping that I showed you some snapshots of earlier. They may not if you look at the back at the Brighton spit, you know, the reality is that little bit of area through here is they're kind of like little islands that will be left should the erosion and inundation progress over the next 100 years. So it's...
Actually quite an interesting one. If, say for example, the South Brighton motor camp that we need to address in the next 2 months, do we actually need to plan, when we think about it, for the next 50 years, or could we just plan for the next 10 to 15 years? Because, I mean, these questions are going to come up for all sorts of redevelopments down there, and there's nothing to say that actually we do need to plan for 50 years for an asset like that. So it may be that we can just think about 10 years out rather than a major investment in an area that...
I think just to find a line of reasonability and to lead people into the whole
But
process to get this information out.
and I agree with that. The trouble is that a rebuild triggers the new rules.
Yeah.
A repair doesn't.
That's a very good question, though, in the sense that generally the life of a district plan is about 10 years, but then doing the long-term natural hazard strategy will give you a direction to move towards, so that in your next review you can move more and more towards whatever direction it is the council wants to set in that long-term strategy.
I think that's true, but you know, I mean, it is a difficult area because a rebuild triggers the new rules. A repair doesn't, and think what I'm saying about people who are only repairing their houses.
Yes.
They're not actually putting themselves into a protected position as against the new rules.
In a sense, these new rules are an incremental step towards the future that still needs to be designed.
Again, finding that balance is with that previous item we struggle with.
Because I don't think anybody, actually, humans even, have the capacity to think 50 years. That's right. 10 years is actually quite difficult for people to project.
That's why we have non-human planners.
Very true.
Well, objective, I meant, you know, rather than subjective. And I think that the other thing is that but it is hard, and the reason that Vicky's right is that people make investment decisions based on the now and what is going to happen in their lifetime and what they can leave to their children. So they're on a narrow framework around investment decisions, but they're thinking long term for their children. You know, and they're wondering what it is that we're going to do in the future that might impact on that decision. So, I mean, you can't make a short-term decision, and I'll just use the park as an example because we haven't made a decision there yet. But the couple that run it, they want to know, is it worth their while to make an investment themselves? So it's not just about the investment of public money, it's do you invest as a private investor in a facility when you don't know what the long-term impact of the location is going to be? I mean, I've been out there after it's been flooded. And I mean, you and I have walked through the flooding together to get to the individual campsites, you know, and it is not an easy place to negotiate in that environment. So, you know, all of these things have got to be on the table, but I mean, I honestly think that sunlight is the best disinfectant. You've got to get the information out there so that people can see that it is not based on a political whim. It's being based on science and what is an appropriate planning framework. And yes, it can be short term, but you've got to have the long term in mind.
It's educative. One of the root words of education is to be led out. So I think in a sense we have to lead people into this. They have to come to it themselves.
And also we must remember the purpose of the Resource Management Act, which is sustainable management for current and future generations. You've hit the nail on the head, and that's why we use the term finding the balance. There is no set rule about how we determine these things, but we're in agreement that we need to explain to the public that we do have to look long term, however still have some rules in place at least for the next 10 years.
I think this is the most important chapter of all, but Phil?
Absolutely, and I think people are starting to say what I was going to say, and it's like some of us had a discussion, and it was a presentation really with the community board Burwood Pegasus Community Board recently. And it was really, I felt really helpful. It wasn't all of this stuff, but it was sort of a lead into this really. And it just seems to me if we can develop a program, and I'm sure we will, of like Glenn talked about education, but it's also just putting it out, but having discussions and opportunity for people to take it on board and think it through, and that we start doing that as soon as possible. Because I guess the other part is against that, getting a petition of 6,000, a large number of people to keep a holiday park. Well, that's not necessarily that helpful in terms of getting the best outcome for the local people or the people who own the holiday park.
Yanni?
So if I'm reading this correctly, what you're saying is anyone that's got purple hatching can't have any new buildings?
No.
It's non-compliant basically.
No, in the
Subdivision.
in the Coastal Erosion Management Area 1 and the Coastal Inundation Management Area 1, where they're both subject to effects in the next 50 years, there's a more restrictive approach on subdivision creating vacant lots and new buildings.
Yeah. So if you just go back to that previous slide that you
So
had.
it's a non-complying activity, that's what the NC is standing for, and that's not prohibition, it is a very high test, but it's not prohibition
So
now.
what's the sort of test?
Or effectively, that ruling would rely on the policies to provide guidance. There's no assessment criteria because that activity status anticipates that be only very limited situations where that activity would go ahead. Now, you've got to consider that in context with the existing use rights that people have. So if people have got property there, they can still enjoy their property, they can still undertake repairs and maintenance and raise floor levels, but if they're wanting to add additional buildings or if they're wanting to subdivide their sites to create additional sites that often lead to more buildings, that would be very restrictive.
If you took like Linwood for example, from Aldwins Road through to like back to Hargood Street.
Do you have the map number there?
At 39, this is an area that the government wants us to intensify, and I don't know where we've got to with the independent government-appointed hearings panel, but this whole area through Linwood, which is in this purple diagonal, effectively shouldn't be being intensified, from my reading of this map.
It can't be coastal erosion.
It's
Linwood's not on the coast.
it's CIMA.
Yeah, you'd really need to, if I can have a wee look over
It's
your shoulder,
coastal
that might be- so I
inundation.
know.
That'll be exactly the same as the finished floor levels though.
If you look at the legend, it's the same.
I thought it was when they were in both CEMA1 and CIMA1. Am I right or wrong?